English man ang language scenario nito. In fact, Cebuano was repeated. It was encouraged. Kung hindi niya ako sinuot, possibly katoanan niya muna akong intention to show the difference between what is tragic and what is comic. Yung mga tao ang ito naka-inspire na po because of the way they behaved or they look and the way they look at life. Tinood na ito po Yun sila na ito wala ginanong nga nakita siya. Pero ngayon sila na ito muna niya tabo. I never saw one.
I think everyone, like if you ask for like a judgment by Cebuano writers of who's the best Cebuano fictionist, it clearly would be Father Rudy. I think I suppose even the other young writers at the time, considered him probably the kind of the most talented fiction writer.
When we entered the campus in USC, we were met by an rather old, frail man who welcomed us into his, I'm not sure if it was his private quarters, but there was a table set and he invited us to eat with him. And of course, he was referred to as Sir Rudy. And I did not know that was, in fact, the man whom everybody said was very reclusive and very elusive. So I only found out later on that I had actually already met Renato Madrid. So that's how I had come to know him. My favorite work of his is his novel, The Mass for the Death of an Enemy, but his short stories also provide very powerful images of tragedy and comedy. And I think he combines both very effortlessly in his stories. Kierkegaard said that wherever there is life, there is contradiction. And tragedy and comedy is located in this human contradiction. And Renato Madrid, he weaves stories together that have so many layers, and there's comedy, there's tragedy. Like in his short story, The Southern Harvest, there's a lot of parts that are very comical, like the game of cat and mouse that is played between the haciendero and the priest. The descriptions of the priest, even the vanity of the priests and his idealism that we know, we perhaps see reflected in some of us. That they're very comical, but at the same time, it's also there's also that tragic element. Like in the end of his story, when the priest loses his idealism, I think tragedy, it's a means for us to kind of come to terms with our place in society. And sometimes it's not, or in the universe, and sometimes it's not a very happy place. Like the priest in the end of the story, when his faith kind of runs dry, and he kind of turns his back on his faith at the end, after his conversation with the rich haciendero.
I was a graduate school student at San Carlos, so I can't recall the year. Must have been something like 69, 70 or thereabouts. Anyway, I think he had already won yung first prize niya. What he got was, I don't know, first prize. So anyway, the free press prize for Southern Harvest, the short story. That was at the time I met him. So he was. I think that was the time he was preparing to leave for the U.S.
Then His Eminence Archbishop Julio Rosales recommended him for a scholarship for graduate studies in literature and music somewhere in the United States. I think it was Minnesota. And this was offered by the president of the Sarah International.
My own personal acquaintance or relationship with Father Rudy is kind off and on, very intermittent over a long period of time. I was actually much closer to a colleague of his, another priest, nga iyang contemporary, who also was in Minnesota. I think they were in the U.S. together. Si Father Virgilio Yap, who's a visual artist, a painter. So si Nene Yap was a much more sociable and outgoing person. So I knew him quite well. He was a movie addict. He would catch the last movie, probably went to all the movies, and on the way back to his parish, close to midnight, he would drop by in the house and we'd talk way past midnight. But Father Rudy is a much more reclusive kind of person.
I already mentioned Southern Harvest earlier, and actually the story tackles the idea of suffering. And this concept of suffering is quite interesting because it's actually to purify a person. So in the story, Don Jose Villegas, the hacendero, has suffered great loss due to the early death of his wife, and his hacienda is also ravaged by fires and other challenges. So Don Jose really hates God, and like Satan, he tries to tempt the missionary who comes and visits him, and indeed he does this by sending a young woman to the missionary's room. But the young missionary runs out of the house into the darkness. So Don Jose also says to him, you cling to him, meaning God, because he has not yet shaken you off. You have not suffered maybe not enough. But the young missionary replies to him that you have suffered much, Don Jose, and that has broken you off from him. In time, your suffering will also bring you together again. So meaning to say there will be a reconciliation between Don Jose and God.
Here the narrator is describing the priest at the end of their conversation. From the door, I could see a dim white figure walking fast along the bushes. He was heading for the other side of the fields. The ground was wet and my feet were bare. From the doorway of the dark granary, I could hear little sounds. The noise of his shoes on the sand, metal sounds, and little bottles and a faint rustle. Then he walked blindly out, past me, into the darkness. He followed the footpath along the shoulder-high cane, and the walk seemed endless. When he reached the tree that marked the boundary of the hacienda, he sank to his knees, gasping like a wounded animal. He held the tree fast with his arms. I stood not very far away, and I heard his sobs, broken sounds coming from his throat, very loud in the night. It was a long time before he stood up and began to move around. He was feeling the ground and picking up sticks and dry leaves. Then he crept towards his bag and felt inside. He struck a match and set it to the pile of sticks. A little fire started and rose, lighting up his wet cheeks and eyes. His hands looked heavy as they moved towards his neck. He took the black cord hanging around it and rolled it into a tiny ball and wiped his face with it. The fire had fallen low. It rose again as it began to eat the black cord, and at last the little wooden crucifix lying over the burning black coal. The little leaden body of the Christ turned to water and slipped into the heart of the flame. He waited for the fire to die. When the embers stopped glowing, he stood up and wiped his hands on his habit. He picked up his bag and felt his way past the broken fence. So in his short story, Madrid really very effortlessly combines his satirical comments, his observations about human nature, and it ends on this very tragic note when the priest kind of loses his faith or enters that very black period in his life where he has lost where he has kind of come to terms with the powerlessness of his faith in the face of like the evil of the rich landowner.
Now, this attitude toward suffering is something that Madrid has expanded in an article in the Varsitarian magazine. I think the title of the article was Man as Hungry. This was sometime in 1962. And, talking about this Christian attitude, he calls this the driving force that has given men the initiative to better their own condition. And it has made them find in themselves the great possibilities of endurance, and more often than not, it has purified men and given their art more depth and perceptiveness and pathos, produced men who were remarkable in quality rather than in quantity.
Suffering is a theme in The Leper because the protagonist, Father George, suffers with this sister due to her affliction. She is a leper and he is tormented by his fears. He is hurt by the misfortune that befalls his sister. The story is about Father George Valdez, a young priest. He encounters the challenges of being a young religious with many problems to face, such as family conflicts and the trials of life. He is also juxtaposed beside an older and wiser priest, Father Aurelio, so they helped each other during the upcoming fiesta. And Father Aurelio is some kind of a father image, being a mentor to Father George in the seminary, and also a friend and as well as a confidant. Another very important theme in the story is that of vanity, since Cedes, Father George's sister, is ostracized for her leprosy. So her family is afraid that they will be contaminated as outcasts of society. In a way, this reflects social conditions as family honor, especially in 20th century Philippines, and I guess even today it is regarded highly. But Cedes is hardly visible in the story, but for what we learn from conversations between the two priests. Cedes, however, never looks at her suffering as something to avoid. Rather, she welcomes it as she bends to God's will. People expect too much from the good things of this life, and others pretend to be larger than life than they really are. So, in a way, Cedes is the scapegoat in the story that makes Father George and his mother realize where their vanity has led them. The Leper, by the way, is one of Madrid's highly acclaimed narratives, winning first prize in the Philippine Free Press contest in 1964. So according to Gregorio Brillantes, who was one of the judges then, and I quote, "Far from being unclean, unwanted, the leper is indeed the best of the lot. The bell that it wears, so to speak, should attract many admiring readers until another Madrid story comes along, perhaps to draw attention from this masterpiece. Superior in theme and substance, The Leper has density and grace, masterful handling of scene and dialogue, movement on more than one level of meaning, virtues we associate with the best of Graham Greene. Renato Madrid has written one of the best stories to be published in decades." This was cited in the Philippines Free Press in December 1965 in Francisco Arceliana's article, Free Press Prize Stories.
Another delightful story is actually The Homecoming, and this is the story of a young boy, Celso, who goes home to his grand uncle, who is actually a retired priest and a former pastor of the Carmen parish. Because the boy goes home because the spiritual director tells him that he does not have the vocation for the priesthood. So he is actually torn. Celso is torn and does not know how to tell his uncle, Father Francisco, about it. So, Father Francisco is a very interesting character because he is some kind of like an atlas figure, somebody who carries the world on his shoulders. He makes decisions, although they may not be always good ones. And Father Francisco believes he can tie the parish on his shoulders despite the fact that he is growing really old. So one of the important aspects of this story that touches me is the subject of age, or aging. It's not easy for Father Francisco to ignore the remarks of being old and careless, like when one of his parishioners tell him, you cannot do those things, not anymore. Of course, we all know that you're too old, you're too feeble. And, to make matters worse, he is dismissed from the parish by the bishop. And it's not easy for him because Father Francisco is a very proud person, and he confesses this to Celso. I think what he said to Celso then was he was wrong, and he was a very proud person, and all along he thought he was very strong, but no, he wasn't strong. And I think the important thing that he talked about here was pride. How often pride passes for strength, and how he also gave in to the panics that descend upon most people, like what we call now panic attacks, even those vowed to the office of trusting God. All right, so the irony is really that Celso realizes Father Francisco has placed all his hopes on Celso to continue the priesthood. And not only is he loved and trusted, but then it's too late, as Celso cannot return to the seminary. So it's very, very sad here. The novel Devil Wings is quite interesting. Just like most characters in Southern Harvest, we have a lot of stories in Southern Harvest. The characters are, in this first novel, is about Filipino priests. And we have Padre Diaz and Padre Lacrava, who are actually opposites, and whose views on life and their vocation differ. Now, Padre Diaz is the type who is traditional and materialistic and so in love with money, while, Padre Lacrava is quite rebellious and independent and also so in love with power. So there are other characters actually. We have the Macaraeg, Dr. Macaraeg, and I think his son, Joe, yes. And from their discussions or their dialogues, we learn what they think about the clergy. But then this brings clear to us that whether or not they are priests or whatever, the characters are really just people. And I think I would like to read from, if I may, from the part 2 of that novel, where you have the poem Alas del Diablo, which actually means the wings of the devil. So the poem reads, "Who shall we say you are? You're God's own hands and feet. And it is you who must his latest thaw begin. Who must where angels fear, like fools rush in. But you heed his call, and flying fall, shall not regain the heights one sought, save in the sphere of thought." And it's quite a longer poem, but it ends by saying that the trouble that one does not soar or serve others. The brave man's cry still rings, but with each traitor word, you gave the devil wings. This is where the title of the novel comes from. But the novel is not really about just the priest, but about Filipinos that, like other human beings, priests can be good and bad. My favorite, though, of his works, which I believe to be his masterpiece, is Mass for the Death of an Enemy. And I can actually spend the entire day talking about Madrid, but I don't want to bore you. So this novel hews closely to Michael Bakhtin's concept of polyphony and heteroglossia in the novel. It speaks with so many voices, and not only because of its magic realist undertones, but because of its breadth. I really fell in love with the novel, which I believe is his best work so far. He has certain characters. It's set in Karkar, very historic. It talks about, like mud. So it's a kind of historical fiction too. Although, and then there's the fight between the traditionally Nambay form and the incoming, tradition of the Zarzuela, and how they rival for audience. So there is a character in this novel, Capitan Delfin, who stands at a watchtower that is being auctioned off, and in this scene that follows, the lines have held me captive over the years, and I would love to share it here. It's a little bit long, just a little bit, but it's worth it, and I'm sure that after I read it, probably you would get yourself a copy of this novel. There are still copies for sale at the Ateneo de Manila University Press. Okay. To be auctioned off was a genuine old watchtower whose stones were the very relatives of the earliest Filipino Christians who had refused to be baptized and then had vanished, accursed and petrified, into the murky depths of local legend or into the nearby forest as monkeys. On a strip of barren coastal land just a few minutes out of Santander town, there stood intact this stone watchtower dating back to the Moro raids. And without doubt, it still stands, now belonging to a local family that deals in sand, gravel, and aggregates. Delfin was there, drawn by the history but not a bit by the crude construction or the scant vegetation ravaged by goats. But he found the price on the tower a bit high, alas, especially for something so purely decorative, and so he decided to steer his money safely away from the auction. He decided to pass the time, a bit uselessly perhaps, up on the tower itself. But that was where his mind suddenly took an unprecedented journey. He lost touch with it there, in that wide open, sun-baked mid-air pulpit. From that limitless window which opened out to two islands that are forever reaching out, but never meet, he found he could not stop himself from gazing. It was a view that roused in him a new longing to touch all the broken shards of the Philippine archipelago and all the nameless, faceless people with whom he shared common ancestry, peculiar culture, and history. To touch them and yet remain apart from them, so as to be free to pronounce praise or blame, to pity or to judge, to join the rebellion or to stay their execution. In short, to be their poet. The experience was so moving that words rushed to his mind unbidden, the lyric of a song being born. He had to find a place to sit while he wrote the poem out on the flyleaf of a book he was reading. It was the first time he had ever tried to write a poem, and the result was nothing extraordinary, especially when he read it again amid the press of standing and jostling fellow passengers in an overcrowded return bus. He blushed at lines of utter idiocy and felt sad that he had accomplished nothing. He had failed to even make a token bid for a minuscule part of his country's cultural heritage, and was now discovering that his farmer's mind was too much wedded to the earth to soar. But at least he had grasped one small aspect of poetry then, that it was something extremely personal, almost a gift one wrapped up for oneself alone, that it was foolish to expect everyone to respond to poetry in the same way or to even respond at all. Not a gift, it was a beautiful burden. It was a melancholy art, and what it served for best was to provide life with a certain aptitude for sadness. That aptitude was necessary for man's dignity to survive and shine through tragic events that the ordinary person's life is filled with. In one of these rare moments of painful clarity, he wrote, "The true purpose of poetry is to keep us from vomiting." That was the last he ever attempted to write a poem, convinced that poetry is best lived, not written to be read or spoken. How wonderful.
Nasa last page sa libro, sa novel. Di man kayo, anang man lang kanang magtukar lang. Ito ang lugar na piano. Kanta siya. Seryoso. Especially sa more fond of local idioms. Seryoso siya sa iyang pagka-tao. Dagan siya naglong ng ano ito. Not even saying kasi Nico King was more prankster. Really, siyempre. It comes as a surprise. Usually the lyrics come afterwards. So, ganit ko kanang akong giyaw na muna. Ay, sa epekto sa akong ibuhat, sa akong work ba. Yun sa magkuhan ko mag-compose. Ang akong uno na kasi siya maka-performan eh. You have to be another mind to look into that angle. So far as I know, it's two different worlds. Akong music, akong writing.
It is true that the music of Mr. Rodi has influenced us a lot in terms of Cebuano church music. But we cannot also deny the fact that there are also choral groups that find it difficult to implement his composition because of the complexity of his piece. So, but we cannot also deny the fact that some of his compositions really helps a lot in terms of church music here in Cebu, and we can say that almost all the parishes here in Cebu use his music his music in the mass.
I would describe his music as, it sounds cliche, but I would describe his music as the work of a genius. Especially when I started learning music theory, I realized that the way he composes his music, specifically his chord choices, it is not usual. It also speaks a lot of meanings. So it continues to amaze me because, especially when he taught me how to write in words, he taught us to choose the words wisely to convey the meaning that we wanted to convey. And he actually uses that principle also in music. His notes, the notes that he chooses and the chords that he chooses also convey a certain meaning and convey a certain sound that I think is very artistic of him. So with Monsignor Rudy's music, more than genius, I would equate his music with meaning and significance. When we speak of Cebu Pop, the first thing that comes to my mind is Rudy's arrangement of Damguman Lang, because Damguman Lang was, if I'm not mistaken, written by Eutychio Solis, a Boholano who was a former seminarian during that time. It was actually Monsignor Rudy who arranged a choral arrangement of Damguman Lang, the winner of Cebu Pop. And that choral arrangement presently is actually one of the staples of Cebuano choirs when we say one of the best Cebuano songs arranged for choir.
It is a challenge, no? It is a challenge for us, no, musicians to really adapt and to really execute or to really implement those music of him. But there's a lot of things to be done, especially in terms of implementing his music, because personally some of his music are difficult to sing and to play. So it is a challenge for every musician, especially those who appreciate the music of Monsignor Rudy, to really practice a lot about and practice this song to the people, to the choral groups around Cebu, to really shall we say, not to murder the song.
Most of the songs daw presently are more of popular lang. Pero with Rudy, during Rudy's time as part of the organizers of Cebu Pop, the songs were not just pleasant to the ears, but not just for popularity's sake, because it's Cebu Popular Music Festival, but it's the songs are really able to capture this is Cebuano music.
All I can say about Monsignor Rudy is thank you for the music. Thank you for every opportunity that he has given to me as a seminarian and as a musician. And during my years of being outside, I really use what I've learned from him.
I would really say I am one of those who have been really influenced by him. And I promised myself I will continue the legacy that he has started, especially for me in music and love for Cebuano heritage and culture.
Think twice. Think twice. This will begin to believe in yourself. And when that happens, done.